of 2016, a woman living in Chicago, Illinois named Jordan Baranskis opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep on the couch the night before. She looked up and the TV was still on, and then she looked down at the other section of the couch and her boyfriend Matt was also asleep on the couch. As much as she wanted to keep sleeping alongside her boyfriend, she had work that day, so she stood up, turned the TV off, and made her way upstairs to get ready. As soon as she got upstairs, the first thing she did is go into her bedroom and get her purse that she left on the foot of her bed. But when she got in the room, her purse wasn't there. So she leaves her bedroom and she starts searching all the rooms upstairs and she can't find her purse. And she's thinking to herself, I'm certain I had it the night before. I remember rifling through my purse before going downstairs and starting to fold laundry before ultimately falling asleep on the couch. So after spending about 15 minutes looking for the purse unsuccessfully, and now she's starting to stress because she's going to be late for work because she can't find her purse, she goes downstairs and she wakes Matt up and says, hey, I gotta find my purse. I thought I left it upstairs. Apparently I didn't. Can you help me look for it? Matt rolls over. He doesn't really want to get up because he's pretty tired and he doesn't have work, so he doesn't want to wake up right now. And he says, well, are you sure you didn't leave it at the restaurant last night? I mean, if you already looked, it's probably not here. You want to just give him a call and see if you left it there? Jordan was immediately really annoyed by his reaction because she just wanted him to stand up and help her look for the purse because she had work and he could just go back to sleep. And so it started this argument between the two of them where Matt just wanted her to call the restaurant because he was convinced she had it there. And Jordan was like, no, I know I had my purse. I'm positive I had it last night before I fell asleep on the couch with you. So their argument begins to escalate a little bit, and that's when Jordan remembers that they had recently installed a Nest camera downstairs to monitor their dogs whenever they were gone. And she thought, we can just look at the footage on the Nest camera, we can see me walking into the apartment, and I will either have or not have my purse in my hand. And so Jordan opens up her app and she calls Matt over and they go back to the night before, right before they left for the restaurant. She's got her purse in hand, they leave the front door, and then several hours go by and they come back in and very clearly Jordan has her purse in her hand. And Jordan turns to Matt and says, told you so. And Matt's like, okay, fine, let me help you look. And as they're about to put the app down, she realizes on the Nest camera timeline that motion was detected at 3:30 in the morning when they were both clearly asleep on the couch. And so she calls Matt back over and says, here, look, there's motion detected at 3:30 in the morning. And they hit play. After the couple had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on, a hooded figure emerges from their upstairs hallway and stands at the top of the stairs and just watches the two of them sleep. Before he left, he stole her purse along with a couple of other things from their apartment. And somehow this guy has never been caught and he's been given the nickname Creeper Ghost. Edna Centrone was born on October 10, 1954 in Puerto Rico, and she was brought to New York by her mother when she was about 5 years old. Edna's family had no money. Her mother, who supported her, was a clerical worker at the New York City Board of Education, where she would bring 2 boiled eggs to work every day so that she wouldn't have to pay for lunch. Edna's family lived in Lower Manhattan on Delancey Street, a neighborhood that was famous for waves of ethnic immigration. Edna had a tough childhood, but she would say she was loved and had enough. In 1987, Edna would meet her future husband, William. William had been visiting his brother at his brother's girlfriend's house in Upper Manhattan. When William walked into the kitchen, Edna was sitting there, and he was so struck with her beauty, he immediately left the room, found his brother, and said, who is that woman sitting in the kitchen? And his brother would tell him that that was Edna. William went right back into the kitchen, and the two of them hit it off right away, and almost immediately they were dating. Every morning, William would leave his Brooklyn apartment and drive all the way to the north end of Manhattan. He would pick up Edna and then drive her to Midtown where she worked. And then he would fight traffic to go to his job. So it was just this horrible, horrible morning commute. But he loved Edna so much, he had no problem in the world doing it. Any chance he got to be around Edna, he was happy. A couple of months after they met, Edna would move in with William in his apartment in Brooklyn, and then 2 years later they would get married. They discovered that Edna was not able to have kids of her own, and so they talked about adopting, and they were really excited about it, but they kept pushing it off for financial reasons. Like a lot of other couples in their neighborhood, they both had to work multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. Edna worked Monday through Friday as an administrative assistant for Marsh & McLennan, which was a large insurance broker located in the World Trade Center. William was a doorman in an apartment building on the swanky Upper East Side. Monday through Friday, after he was done working as a doorman at about 3 p.m., he would go to Harlem, where he and Edna owned a small flower shop, and he would work there until 8 p.m. at night. And then over the weekends, he and Edna would work at the flower shop. For fun, they liked to drive north to Bear Mountain State Park, where they would meet up with friends and relatives for barbecues and cookouts. And anytime they had a little bit of extra money, they loved going to Atlantic City and spending a little bit of cash on the slots and then taking advantage of the free food that came with gambling. But more than anything else, William and Edna got the most enjoyment out of each other. They were madly in love and inseparable for all 14 years they were together. That even on their worst days, when they came home and things just weren't right, they would always sit down together and they would eat their favorite ice cream and watch their favorite TV show together. On September 11, 2001, William dropped Edna off at the World Trade Center where she worked. She made her way up to the 93rd floor of the North Tower where Martian McLennan was. She took her seat at her desk and began the day like any other day. At 8:46 a.m. that morning, a plane that had been hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists intentionally flew into the North Tower, crashing into floors 93 through 99. Everyone on board the plane and hundreds of people inside the towers where it was struck were killed instantly. Edna survived the initial crash, but she, like everybody else who was at floor 92 and up inside the North Tower on 9/11, were all trapped. Shortly after the crash, a cameraman on the ground was filming the impact site on the side of the World Trade Center, and they inadvertently captured Edna Centrone coming to the edge, clutching onto a metal girder, and she appears to be waving as if she's hoping someone is going to come up here and save her. But of course, there was no way to get to her, and she, like so many others that were trapped inside of the Twin Towers, had to make the terrible choice of waiting for the fire to consume me or jumping out this window. We don't know what her final choice was. However, we do know she was one of the 2,976 people who lost their life during that terrorist attack. On September 22nd, 2006, 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle. Cassie was very responsible, and so her aunt and uncle didn't just trust her to house-sit, they also regularly asked her to babysit their son. During this particular house-sitting weekend, Casey had invited her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, over to the residence to watch a movie with her. She had also invited two other friends named Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, who were classmates of her and Matt's. And so while the four teens are watching this movie, Brian and Tori kind of awkwardly stand up and announce to the other two that they don't want to watch a movie on the TV, they want to go watch a movie in the movie theater, and they promptly leave. Cassie and Matt thought it was a little bit odd that they would come over here specifically to watch a movie with them, only to say, we don't want to watch a movie with you guys, we want to watch it in the theater, but they didn't think much of it and they stayed to finish the movie. Unbeknownst to Cassie and Matt, when Brian and Tori left, they actually looped around to the back of the residence and unlocked the basement door so they could quietly re-enter later. Because these boys had been planning to do something absolutely horrible to Cassie, and they planned on doing it that night. Brian and Tori idolized serial killers. When Brian and Tori happened to watch the movie Scream together, which is a popular horror movie where this masked villain sneaks into teenagers' homes and terrorizes them, they decided that that would be the way they gained infamy. They would reenact the murder scenes from the movie Scream, but in real life. Shortly after this revelation, they begin filming themselves as they come up with their big plan of how they're going to break into someone's home and what they're going to do to them. And at some point on camera, they would say that they've identified their first victim, and it's going to be Cassie Jo Stoddart. They just needed to wait for a time when she was going to be alone. And when they found out she was going to be house sitting over that weekend in September for her aunt and uncle, they put their plan into motion. But when they showed up and Matt Beckham was there, Cassie's boyfriend, it kind of screwed up their plan. And so that's why Brian and Tori had stood up and said they were going to go watch a movie at the movie theater, because what they really wanted to do was come back later when Matt wasn't there anymore so they could attack Cassie. So Brian and Tori leave, and they do go to the movie theater, and they do buy tickets because they figure this is a great opportunity to create a solid alibi for themselves. But they don't stick around for the movie. They get back in their car and they drive around and film themselves excitedly talking about how great it's going to be when Cassie's all alone and they can attack her. After a couple of hours of driving around, they can't wait any longer, and they figure that Matt must be gone by now. They park at the end of the street, they get out, they put on their masks and their gloves, and they sneak around to the side of the house where there was that open door that Brian had left. They open it up and then go inside of the residence where Cassie was, and they can hear upstairs that Matt is still there. Brian and Tori at this point felt so committed that they just said, you know what, we're gonna have to kill Matt too. So straight out of a horror movie, Brian and Tori hide in the basement wearing their mask and their gloves, they've got their knives, and they start making all this noise to try to get Cassie and Matt to come downstairs to see what's making all the sound. But it doesn't work. They don't come downstairs. So the next thing they do is they go to the circuit breakers and they cut the power to the house, hoping that Matt and Cassie will come downstairs to try to turn it back on. But again, Matt and Cassie stay upstairs. And so Brian and Tori turn the power back on and just continue to make sounds in the basement in hopes that Matt or Cassie, or hopefully both, would come downstairs so they could live out this fantasy. Meanwhile, upstairs, Matt and Cassie hadn't heard any of the sounds going on in the basement, but when the power went out, Cassie got really frightened and she asked Matt would he please stay with her overnight, and so Matt calls his mom and asks if that would be okay, and she says no, but you can invite Cassie over to our house and she can stay with us, and then tomorrow morning I'd be happy to drive her back to her aunt and uncle's house. But at the time the offer was made, the lights had come back on and Cassie had kind of calmed down and said, you know what, Matt, I'm actually just fine. I'm gonna stay here. At approximately 10:30 p.m. that night, Brian and Tori could hear Matt's mom showing up, picking him up and taking him home. And they were fairly certain that Cassie was alone, but they were gonna wait for a couple minutes to make sure she really was. As they were waiting, Matt actually called Tori and said, hey, I just left Cassie's house. Can I come meet up with you guys? And Matt would later tell police that he couldn't really understand what Tori was saying. It was like he was whispering. And so Matt assumed that he must still be in the movie theater watching the movie, and Matt kind of gave up on the idea of meeting up with them and ultimately just hung up. And so after Tori got off the phone with Matt, he turned to Brian and said, she's alone. Matt just said so. Brian and Tori turned the power off once again and then walked up the stairs and slammed a closet door in hopes that it would entice her to come into the basement. But it didn't work because Cassie was horrified. She heard the slamming door, the lights are out and she's all alone, and so she's huddled up on the couch, terrified. So Brian and Tori, frustrated they can't live out their fantasy exactly the way they wanted to by attacking her in the basement, so they go upstairs, walk into the living room where Cassie is huddled on the couch fearing for her life, and they proceed to stab their friend to death. After the murder, Brian and Tori ran from the house, got in their car, and the first thing they did is they fired up their video camera and they filmed their excited reaction to ending Cassie's life. Brian and Tori believed they had a solid alibi because they had those movie tickets, but after Cassie's body was discovered just a couple of days later, the police immediately went to Matt Beckham, her boyfriend, and started questioning him, and he immediately said, well, Brian and Tori were the only other two people that were with us that night. The police go to Brian and Tori, and under intense questioning, Brian and Tori would confess to what they had done. They were convicted and given life sentences without the opportunity for parole. Here is some of the video footage that was found on their camera.
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie's daughter. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I locked the back doors, so it's all locked. Now we just gotta wait. I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie.
On February 27, 2015, 18-year-old Ballen Pua was visiting his grandmother on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Ballen, who was a Hawaiian native himself, didn't spend much time in Oahu with his grandmother, and since he was here, he figured he would do the one thing he had always wanted to do, which was to climb the island's very famous and very illegal haiku stairs, or better known as the Stairway to Heaven. These stairs were a very narrow, rusty, not well maintained, 4,000 step staircase that weaved its way up the side of this Hawaiian mountain. It was built during World War II by the United States Navy because they wanted access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and it was not well maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987 and literally put a fence up and even put guards out to keep people from going in. But Ballen really wanted to do this. So that morning he tells his grandmother that he's thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. And his grandmother's like, that's a horrible idea. Not only is it dangerous, but they're going to fine you thousands of dollars if they catch you doing that. Ballen backed down from what he said and he said, okay, I won't go. And he kind of played it off like, I'm not going to go on this hike. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and he made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal and he was incriminating himself, he was so excited about going on this hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. And so the first picture begins with him at the base of the stairs where he posts a picture as he's about to start this hike. And then all morning he's taking pictures along the way up these 4,000 stairs. But then around 11 a.m. that morning, the posting stops abruptly and he hasn't reached the summit. And you figure if you're going to do this hike and you're already posting pictures of just the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you're going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post all of those because that's the prize at the end of this hike. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly hadn't reached the summit yet. And by that night, when he didn't come home, the family was really concerned and they told police. Police launched this huge search for him. They're looking all over the stairs. They got helicopters out. The Navy gets involved. There's no sign of him. He's just vanished. When they couldn't find him after several days, they had to call the search off, and the assumption was, well, you're doing something dangerous. There's a reason this is off limits. He probably slipped at some point and fell down the mountain. That's why this is off limits. It's not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something in this picture. This shot looks like he's just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down a little ways down the trail that appears to be hiding. And many people believe that that guy was following Ballen and at some point attacked him. That Ballen didn't fall off the mountain, he was abducted or killed. To this day, Ballen has never been found and that mystery man has never been identified. The most remote island in the world is Bouvet Island. It is an uninhabited 19 square mile chunk of rock and ice situated in the South Atlantic. If you were looking on a map and drew a 1,000 mile radius around Bouvet Island, there would be nothing else in it. There's no land, there is nothing. In fact, the nearest land is 1,100 miles away and it's Antarctica that's not permanently inhabited. The nearest permanently inhabited land is South Africa, and that's 1,600 miles away. The island is so far away from anything that in 1979, Israel and South Africa dropped 2 nuclear bombs on it, and nobody noticed. The only reason anybody found out about it is because a US satellite happened to be looking in its direction, and it saw 2 bright flashes of light, and they were like, I wonder what that is, and then it turned out to be nuclear testing. For the very few people that have gone to Bouvet Island, you can't just take a ship there or a boat there because all around the edges of this island are these jagged ice cliffs, and then the water is treacherous down near the edge of these cliffs with very strong currents. If you were to fall in, you'd get sucked up and probably underneath some of these rocks and then you're done for. So nearly anyone who's stepped foot on Bouvet Island has taken a helicopter and flown the long, sketchy flight, hoping you don't hit a storm because you can't land anywhere. You're in the middle of nowhere with no land, all the way to Bouvet Island. And then anyone that's been on Bouvet Island only stays for like a few minutes because they're so worried about a storm rolling in. And the weather at Bouvet Island is famously bad and storms are constantly rolling in. Oh, and Bouvet Island is an active volcano. So it's this horrible place that nobody goes to or should go to. But a few people still do. In 1964, British explorer Alan Crawford was sent out to Bouvet Island with a team of scientists to inspect the northwest corner of the island where a recent lava flow had created a shelf that looked like you could potentially build a building on it. And the British wanted to stand up a weather station out there, but they needed someone to go out there and give the green light. So on April 2nd, 1964, Crawford and his crew departed South Africa and began the long helicopter ride. When they finally touched down on Bouvet Island, everybody was on edge because you are in the most remote place in the world, and if anything happens to you, there's no help coming for you. So people were eager to get the work done, survey the area, and get right back on the helicopter and leave. So the team immediately gets to work surveying the site, while Crawford decides to just for a couple minutes to step over the ridge and just look out at the island. He was fascinated with Bouvet Island and he just wanted to get a better look at it. So he walks up this embankment and he crests the hill and he looks down, and there's this little rocky alcove that he can see the water. It's at this one area of the island where there's a little bit of a beach, and he sees a wooden lifeboat that's kind of half sunken sitting in the shallow waters of this lagoon. He couldn't believe it because he knows it's not theirs because they came in on helicopter. And he's also thinking, like, how could this boat have gotten here at all? The nearest land is 1,100 miles away. So he starts walking down towards the boat and he sees on the beach 2 wooden oars that he assumes go with the boat. Next to them is a flattened copper tank that's used to catch water, and then next to that was a wooden barrel, which also would have been used to store water. He starts looking around the beach for other signs of human life, and there are none. There's no tent, there's no clothes, there's no human remains. He finally gets down to the beach and actually wades out the little ways into the water to actually inspect this lifeboat, and he starts looking for identifying marks or numbers on the boat that might give away where it's from, but there's no significant marking on the boat. It was in pretty good shape, but there was just nothing to give away where it was from. Because Crawford knew they had very little time before they were going to leave the island, he ran back on shore and he looked around on the beach some more. He walked up the hill a ways to get a look down the island to see if there's any sign of human life on this island, but there's none. And so he goes back over to his team and he tells them what he's found. But his team is so focused on getting this survey done and getting the heck out of here that they don't really care about this lifeboat. And they say, you know what, it probably washed up from some shipwreck or something. There's probably some explanation for it. Let's just get this done and get out of here. Crawford feels a little bit frustrated because he's fascinated by what he's just found and he wishes they were too. So he just walks back over the hill and he takes his camera out and he takes a picture of the lifeboat. After that, he hopped in the helicopter, flew back to South Africa, and he showed this picture to his superiors, and he was hoping they would launch some sort of investigation to see who was out there. But much like his team, who didn't care when they were already at Bouvet Island, his superiors, who were thousands of miles away from Bouvet Island, just didn't care very much about some random lifeboat on some random island in the middle of nowhere. But 2 years after Crawford's expedition, another crew was sent out to Bouvet Island to survey the lagoon where this lifeboat was found, and the crew would report that they found the lagoon, but there was no boat, there was no barrel, there was no copper tank, there was no oars, there was nothing. It was as if it was never there. So while we don't know how the boat got there or how it left, or who was on the boat and where they went, what we do know is at some point, some poor soul or souls were trapped on the most isolated and wretched island in the entire world. In central Texas lies a stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It's this beautiful clear water spring that every summer when the weather gets really hot in Texas, people converge on Jacob's Well and enjoy swimming in the water. But it's not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It's for daredevils that strap scuba gear on and dive down through Jacob's Well through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 chambers. As you move from chamber 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces, and each of the chambers gets smaller and they get darker because you're losing sunlight, and they just become overall much more difficult to navigate the deeper you go. Imagine you put on your scuba gear and you hop into Jacob's Well and you start swimming straight down. Now there's going to be what looks like the floor of the well, and then at the center of it is a 10-foot wide shaft that goes straight down. And if you swim down through that, you're going to reach the first chamber, which sits at about 30 feet and goes all the way down to 55 feet. In that first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there's algae, there's wildlife, and it's where rookie scuba divers will spend their time in Jacob's Well. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it's more narrow than the very first one you went through. And that shaft, that tunnel, is actually what makes up the second chamber. And it brings you down all the way to 80 feet. So from 55 feet to 80 feet, you are in the second chamber, and it's basically a tube. Any diver that's going to be in Jacob's Well has to be aware when you are in the second chamber on your ascent to not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is this opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber into the first chamber, but it's not. It's a dead end that loops around before you hit a wall, and you gotta go all the way back out. So hopefully you have enough air at that point. The second chamber attracts novice scuba divers and intermediate scuba divers. You still have light coming in, but it's definitely more tight, it's more claustrophobic, and because of that false chimney, it's a little bit more hazardous going into the second chamber. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, which is the bottom of the second chamber, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your tanks on that will bring you into a very small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there's all the silt and loose gravel inside of the third chamber that if your fin so much as knocks it, it will float into the water and then it will blind you. The third chamber is only from 80 feet to 90 feet, so it's only 10 feet of water. Generally speaking, you only see expert divers going into the third chamber. At the bottom of the third chamber is this heavy metal grate that sits over this tiny little opening, and that is the opening to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it looks like inside of the fourth chamber because, one, as soon as you go in there, it's impossible not to kick up a ton of silt, so you're going in blind. But two, anyone that has attempted to go into the fourth chamber and maybe has been successful has died. There are literally divers that are deceased inside of the fourth chamber. And after about a dozen people died trying to get into that fourth chamber, they finally just sealed it up. But if you were to pry open that gate and go into the fourth chamber, you would have to remove your air tanks, push them into the fourth chamber, and then you'd have to wriggle your way through while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth into the fourth chamber that, again, we don't even know what's in there. In 1983, 24-year-old college students Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 p.m. They were both experienced scuba divers. They were in an advanced scuba diver class with all the certifications for that. They had dove Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water, they went through that initial shaft into the first chamber, they continued into the tunnel that was the second chamber, they wriggled their way into the third chamber, and they reached the gate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open this gate, and Richard Patton was the first one to go into the fourth chamber. He removed his tanks and pushed them inside of this opening, and then he began headfirst to slither inside of this fourth chamber opening while Clark waited. And Clark would later say that as soon as Richard had pushed his way and had actually made it into the fourth chamber, Richard comes screaming up back out of the fourth chamber. And Clark realizes that he doesn't have a mouthpiece in, he doesn't have scuba tanks on. Richard is desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold because he's dropped his tanks, and he's reaching for Clark to help him get pulled through this hole, and he can barely get out of this hole. And as soon as he gets free, Clark takes his mouthpiece off and he jams it into Richard's mouth. And so they begin buddy breathing. One guy breathes while the other guy holds his breath, and then they reverse that back and forth, back and forth. That's not something you would do on a dive for a long period of time. It's an emergency procedure, and you need to get to the surface as soon as you can. So the pair calms down, they're buddy breathing, and they're making their way back up. They're leaving the equipment that they lost in the fourth chamber, and they're kicking their way up, and they get back into the third chamber. They make their way up into the second chamber. They're kicking it out, and then their heads hit the wall. And they realize they've gone down the false chimney, and what's even worse is they hear that awful ka-tung, which means you have no air in your tanks. Clark, who had taken a full breath before this had happened, he immediately turns and starts swimming and manages to get out of the false chimney and makes it to the surface before he drowns. But Richard wasn't as lucky. His final few moments were spent in total darkness with silt kicked up all around him. He's got no air, he's got no idea where to go, and he's desperately trying to swim up, but he keeps hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. On April 9th, 2015, residents of the tiny farming community Fairdale, Illinois, woke up to heavy rains outside and an ominous forecast. Severe thunderstorms were going to persist all day, and then at night there was a chance of a tornado. Meteorologists were telling residents of Fairdale that if you can, you should evacuate because it's not worth sticking around for. But if you're going to ride out the storm, make sure you've taken the necessary precautions and make sure you have a plan for how to get to a shelter if the storm gets really bad. That morning, some forecasters were saying this tornado could prove to be one of the biggest in Illinois' history. But most of the 152 Fairdale residents had lived here their whole lives, and they had seen bad storms before, even tornadoes, and they had ridden them out before. How could this one be any different? You know, most of the time, the worst that happened was maybe a power line comes down and you lose power for the day. But unlike previous storms, this one was getting worse and worse by the minute, and by 6 p.m. that night, forecasters were no longer theorizing that this could be a huge tornado. They were outright pleading with Fairdale residents to evacuate while you still can. But despite these warnings, the vast majority of Fairdale residents stayed put. They were committed to riding the storm out. By 7 p.m., meteorologists were saying this tornado is imminent and it looks as big or bigger than the last major tornado that came through Illinois that killed 8 people and leveled an entire town. This tornado tonight is going to kill people. Just 15 minutes later at 7:15, the tornado finally touched down right outside of Fairdale. It was this massive, almost mile-wide tornado with over 200-mile-an-hour winds, and unlike other tornadoes of that size that typically move at about 30 miles an hour, this one was traveling on land at about 15 miles an hour, meaning it would be sitting over the areas. It was devastating for longer amounts of time, making it even worse than some of the worst predictions that meteorologists had for this tornado. 15 minutes later at 7:30 p.m., 84-year-old Fairdale resident Clem Schultz and his wife Jerry Schultz, they were at home because they had decided to ride out the storm. As Clem is sitting in the living room watching the Weather Channel, kind of waiting for the last possible second to go into their basement, he hears his wife yell out from the kitchen to come in here and look at this. So Clem goes into the kitchen and she's pointing out the back window, and he looks out and he sees this massive tornado coming right at them. It's less than a mile away and it is way bigger than he thought it was going to be. But from their perspective, because the tornado was spinning counterclockwise, it kind of looked like it was spinning away from town into this empty field. And Clem says to his wife, Jerry, you know what? It looks like it's going to miss us, but we're probably going to lose power. So I'm going to go up into the attic and get some lanterns ready. So Jerry stays in the kitchen. Clem goes up into the attic, and as he's fishing to get out the lanterns, he hears what sounds like a freight train barreling through town. And he had this little window at the edge of his attic. So he goes over and he looks out, and the tornado had not veered off into the open field. It had continued straight towards his house, and it was ripping off roofs right in front of him. And he figured, I don't have enough time to go down into the basement. I have no time to do anything. So he takes out his phone and he begins recording. Clem's house, along with all the others in that video, collapsed. And initially, Clem thought he had died because it went totally quiet and it was totally dark. And he actually said out loud, "Am I dead?" But it was the pain in his back from a crushed vertebrae that told him, no, you survived. And he begins to kind of pull himself out of the rubble, and before long, a neighbor is pulling him out. And as soon as he's out of the rubble of his house, he looks around and his whole community is pretty much gone. And as he's standing there kind of bewildered, his neighbor says, "Clem, don't look down." And Clem says, "Why?" And his neighbor says, "Because your wife is under you and she's dead." When the dust had finally settled, not only had Clem's wife been killed, but Clem's neighbor had been killed as well, because the tornado went directly through their 2 houses. That video that Clem shot is now used to educate people on how dangerous tornadoes really are, and how anytime a tornado is coming through your area, never go outside to film it, seek shelter. On Sunday, February 12th, 2017, Abigail Williams was over her best friend, Liberty German's house for a sleepover. Abby and Libby were 13 and 14 respectively. That night, as they're laying in bed, they were looking out the window hoping they saw snowflakes come down because there was apparently this huge storm that was going to roll through the next day, and they were hoping that if it did, school would be canceled the next day. But when they woke up the next morning, it hadn't even snowed. However, they found out that in Delphi, Indiana, where they lived, school had been canceled preemptively in anticipation of this big storm that never really amounted to anything. So the girls got a free day off where they could actually go outside and enjoy it. So the girls start talking about how they're going to spend their extra day off, and Libby suggests, well, why don't we go check out the Monon High Bridge? It was this abandoned bridge that crossed over the stream, and a lot of their classmates would take pictures on it and post it to their social media, and the girls figured this is a great day to go do that. So Libby asks her grandmother, Becky, who was her primary caretaker, if it would be okay if they went for a hike over near this bridge. Becky gives them permission, but with the caveat that they would find their own ride there and back. So Libby convinces her older sister, Kelsey, to give them a ride there, and Libby speaks to her father, Derek, and he says he can pick them up, but he'd only be able to pick them up at a very specific time, which would only give the girls a couple of hours at the bridge, but they thought that was fine and that was plenty of time. So a couple hours later, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, Kelsey drops off the two girls at the start of the trail that's going to bring them to this bridge. We know the girls made it to the bridge because at 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a picture to her social media of Abby walking across the bridge. At 3:11 p.m., Libby's father, Derek, texted her and said, hey, I'm going to be there in a minute. Just want to make sure you guys are there to meet me. And she didn't text Derek back, and Derek would later say that that was pretty unusual for her. At 3:14 p.m., Derek arrives at the meeting spot, and the girls are nowhere to be found. And so Derek tries calling. There's no answer. He texts his daughter, no response. And so he ends up calling Becky, Libby's grandmother, his mother, and says, hey, did the girls contact you and change plans about where I was picking them up or when? And Becky said, no, I haven't heard from them. They said they'd be there at 3. They should be there now. I haven't heard from them. And Derek says he can't get in touch with them. So for the next 10 minutes, Becky and her husband, Mike, Libby's grandfather, just try calling over and over and over again to the girls, but nothing's going through. They can't get them to respond to text messages. So Mike leaves and meets up with Derek in the parking lot, and the two of them begin walking the trail to try to find these girls. At this point, the family's not suspecting foul play. They're thinking, the girls probably got lost, or they lost track of time, or their phones just ran out of batteries, or maybe they did get hurt and they can't move, but it's probably not that serious. They're creating scenarios in their head to rationalize what's happening. But by the time the sun went down at about 5 p.m. and there was still no sign of these girls, they ended up calling the police and officially reporting the girls missing. By 6 p.m. that night, there is this massive search combing the trail looking for these girls, but all night they're looking everywhere with hundreds of searchers and there's no sign of them. The following day, on Tuesday, February 14th, one of the searchers was about a half mile away from the bridge where the girls had been taking those pictures, and they discovered the girls' bodies right next to a creek. The police didn't release their cause of death. However, they said, without a doubt, this is a homicide, because apparently the scene was incredibly disturbing and had at least 2 or 3 signatures. Signatures are things done to the victims that are above and beyond what is required to end their life. Things like writing on the victims or their body position, or much, much worse. And usually you only see signatures when you're dealing with a serial killer. 3 days after the bodies were discovered, police were able to extract some video from Libby's phone. It turns out when Libby was taking those pictures of Abby on the bridge and had just posted it to social media, apparently this guy had come on the bridge and Libby must have sensed danger and she began filming him. Now, there is apparently a video that starts from the bridge and lasts all the way through the girls' final moments, but the police would release a very small snippet of this recording because it showed who they believe is the killer walking towards them with his hands in his pockets looking down, and he says to them, guys, down the hill.
Guys, down the hill. Guys, down the hill.
Despite thousands of tips pouring in as soon as this video was made public, they still don't know who this guy is, no arrests have been made, and the case remains unsolved. Before The Bachelorette pitted 30 men against each other to win one woman's heart, Americans watched another show about random strangers competing for a mate. It was called The Dating Game. Starting in 1965, this reality show featured a woman asking 3 men questions without seeing their faces, and based on their answers, at the end of the show, she would choose one to go on a date with. On the surface, the September 13th, 1978 showing of The Dating Game looks like every other episode with lots of unsubtle innuendo, but this episode would go down in history as a one-of-a-kind, and not in a good way. At the end of this particular show, it was time for the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, to make her decision, and she would choose Bachelor number 1, who would turn out to be this tall, good-looking, long-haired guy whose name was Rodney. Rodney comes around the partition and they see each other for the first time and everybody laughs and they hug, and the show looks like every other show, and on stage, Rodney looks like every other contestant that's ever been on the show. But after the show ended and Cheryl and Rodney went backstage and actually began having a real conversation that was not being filmed, Cheryl would say that Rodney completely changed. He became incredibly creepy and was saying things like, "I always get the girl." And then at some point he says, "Hey, you should come out with me tonight. It'll be a date you'll never forget." And she turns to him and just says, "No thanks." This would turn out to be a really wise decision because Rodney was a horrible, horrible person. Had the show done a background check on Rodney, they would have discovered that he assaulted an 8-year-old and went to jail for 3 years for it and was currently on parole. But even if they had done a background check on Rodney, the check would not have discovered what he did at night. Rodney was shamelessly cocky and self-confident, and unlike a lot of men, he had no issue walking right up to any woman anywhere and flirting with her. And he used that to his advantage. He would go up to women in bars and he would convince them that he was a fashion photographer and that they were so beautiful, would you come back to my apartment and do a photo shoot with me? And just like Cheryl on the dating show, these women were immediately kind of charmed by him and would say yes. Once they got back to his apartment, he would shut and lock the door and then become that creepy guy that Cheryl saw backstage. But unlike Cheryl, who at the time she saw this just said, "I'm not interested," and was able to leave, these women were trapped. And then whether they wanted to or not, they would do a photo shoot with him and then he would strangle them to death. Because Rodney Alcala was not your typical dating game contestant. He was a serial killer who by the time he stepped foot on that show and was chosen by Cheryl Bradford to win the game, he had already killed 4 people. And over a 2-year period, he killed as many as 130 people, which if you're doing the math, is over those 2 years, he was killing at least 1 person a week. Alcala was finally apprehended and he was sentenced to death. Here are some highlights from Rodney Alcala's episode of The Dating Game.
And we're going to start by having them say hello to you and see how they sound. Number 1, would you say hello to Cheryl, please?
We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl.
Okay, and here we go.
Bachelor number 1,
Yes.
what's your best time?
The best time is at night, nighttime,
Why do you say that?
because that's the only time there is.
The only time? What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but nighttime's when it really gets good.
Bachelor number 1, I am serving you for dinner.
Oh,
What are you called and what do you look like?
I'm called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
I'm going to ask you a question. Will that date be Bachelor number 1, Bachelor number 2, or Bachelor number 3? Who gets the dates?
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take 1.
Number 1, Bachelor number 1, all right. He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer. Say hello to Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on and say hello. Congratulations, Rod. You did it with a 1 answer.
Oksana Malaya was born November 4th, 1983, to very poor and alcoholic parents in the Ukraine. In the winter of 1986, when Oksana was only 3 years old, in a drunken stupor, her parents forgot about her outside in the cold of winter. And because she was locked out, instinctively she crawled towards the nearest source of warmth, which was the family's kennel where a whole bunch of dogs were sleeping. And incredibly, once she crawled inside of this kennel, not only did the dogs allow her to sleep there that night, but they kind of embraced her as one of their own. The next day, Oksana did not go back in the house, and her parents seemingly did not notice her absence. And over the next 5 years, Oksana would stay with this family of dogs, essentially living like she was part of their pack, which meant over those 5 very formative years from ages 3 to 8 years old, Oksana had almost no interaction with humans. Oksana rapidly learned how to behave like a dog and began only walking on all fours. She would bark instead of try to speak, and she would eat raw meat. By the early 90s, Oksana no longer identified as a human. She identified as a dog. And it was in the early 90s when a passerby happened to see Oksana running around on all fours in the back of her house in the woods, and they called the police, wondering what was wrong with this person. The police show up, and Oksana's dog family runs out and starts barking at the police to protect Oksana, and Oksana would start barking ferociously to protect herself from being captured. But eventually the police would use meat to lure the rest of the dogs away so they could retrieve the child. When she was taken into custody, doctors saw that she not only had forgotten how to walk on 2 legs, she also couldn't speak. And doctors were concerned that because she had had almost no exposure to human language for all those formative early years, that she might not actually have the capacity to speak anymore. Oksana was taken to an orphanage where she would eventually learn how to walk on 2 legs, and amazingly, she would learn how to speak. But despite these incredible gains she made towards re-entering society, her experience living with the dogs had really left a mark on her. Although she could speak, she could only speak in monotone with no rhythm and no intonation, and it was actually difficult to follow what she was saying because of that. A psychologist did an assessment of Oksana and determined that her mental capacity was only that of a 6-year-old, despite being a young adult at the time of this assessment. By the time she was 22 years old and had more or less re-entered society, she finally was able to have a boyfriend, and he didn't know much about her past. But when she decided to show him how easy it was for her to run around and bark like a dog, it apparently scared him, and he broke up with her and did not see her again. Today, Oksana lives on a farm taking care of animals, and she was recently interviewed on a Ukrainian talk show where she says she no longer wants to live like or act like a dog, she just wants to be a person. Here is some footage of Oksana Malaya acting like a dog. After being apart for many years, identical twin sisters Ursula and Sabina Eriksson were finally reunited on May 15th, 2008. Within 24 hours of their long-awaited reunion, the 41-year-old Swedish sisters boarded a ferry for Liverpool, England. They arrived in Liverpool at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, May 17th, and their first stop was going to the St. Anne's police station, where Sabina would tell them that she's very concerned for the safety of her kids back in Ireland. The police would say, okay, we'll follow up, and they got in touch with their counterparts in Dublin, Ireland, who went over to the house and everything was fine. So the women leave the police station on foot and they make their way over to a bus stop, and they ultimately board a bus bound for London at about 11:30 in the morning. So they get in the bus and they start moving, and the driver asks them to take their luggage and put it in the luggage hold. But the women aggressively refuse to give up their luggage. And in fact, they start clutching their luggage against their chest. So the driver starts to feel really uncomfortable about having these 2 women on the bus, and ultimately decides to just pull over at a service station outside of the city and tell them to get off the bus. They get off, and the driver ends up calling the police and telling them there's something weird going on with these 2 women. I don't know what's inside their bags, but you might want to come check it out. As it happened, there was already a police officer at the service station who came right over to the women and started talking to them as the bus driver took off. During their conversation, the police officer felt like these 2 women were not a threat to anybody, and it was just a big misunderstanding, and they let them go. So the officer leaves, and these 2 women who don't have a car start walking down the highway on foot. Shortly thereafter, a security camera on the highway picks up the 2 women walking down the median of this very busy highway. And at some point, they try to cross the street. And it's obvious as you're watching this video that they're not going to make it. There's so many cars. And immediately, Sabina gets hit by a car. Now, Sabina was only grazed by the car, so she was okay, and she and her sister went back to the median of this highway. But enough motorists saw this happen that they called the police. And it just so happened that the responding patrol car that was in the area was being shadowed by a film crew that was filming for a TV show called Traffic Cops. So this patrol car shows up with cameras rolling, and they're able to get the sisters from the median over to the shoulder on the other side of the road. And they're talking to them like, what's going on? What are you doing here? And on camera, everything seems totally fine. Like there is no major issues here. These women were just stranded and were making some bad decisions walking down a highway on foot. Then all of a sudden, Ursula turns away from the officers and tries to run into traffic. And there are cars whizzing by. They have not stopped traffic. And one of the officers manages to grab her arm, but only gets her jacket, which she's able to wriggle out of before launching into traffic, literally leaping into traffic, and gets hit by a huge truck going 60 miles an hour and gets thrown down the road. Literally a second later, as everyone's like, what is going on? Sabina yells, "They're gonna steal your organs!" And she leaps into traffic and gets hit by another car. Immediately, police run in the road, they stop traffic, and they go up to Ursula, who was the first to get hit, and they see her legs are definitely broken, but she's alive. As for Sabina, she was totally unconscious, and they didn't know if she was going to make it. When the paramedics finally show up, Ursula, who has the broken legs, fights to sit up, and they're trying to tell her, like, lay down, you're hurt, you have shattered legs, you're lucky to be alive, lay down. She's not listening. In fact, she's violently trying to sit up, and she starts spitting at the paramedics and the police and screaming obscenities at them like they're trying to hurt her. And they're like, we're the police, we're the paramedics, we're trying to help you. At the same time, Sabina regains consciousness, and even though paramedics and police are trying to keep her laying on the ground, she begins fighting her way up and is pushing the police off of her, and finally stands up and literally squares off with one of the police officers and decks her in the face before running down the road. Police would have to run down the road after her and literally surround her as she's got her fists up like she's going to fight anybody that touches her, and they would have to tackle her to the ground and put her in handcuffs just to keep her from hurting herself. Both sisters would be transported to the hospital, and when they got there, they both apparently were acting normal again. Ursula, because of her broken legs, would be admitted to the hospital, and apparently she would stay normal and would eventually make a recovery and would be released. There were no charges pressed against her. As for Sabina, the doctors checked her out, and she didn't appear to have any injuries. So they released her, and she was brought to the police station to be charged for punching the police officer in the face. That day, Sabina would plead guilty to her charges and would be sentenced to 1 day in custody that she served that night. The next day, she was released. So Sabina leaves the police station on foot, and later that night, she's walking down the road when she sees two men walking towards her who were named Glenn and Peter. She stops them and she says, "Hey, I'm looking for a bed and breakfast. Are there any good ones nearby?" And Glenn would say, "You know, it's funny, I own a bed and breakfast. You can stay at mine." Initially, Sabina seemed hesitant, like perhaps this was a trap, but ultimately she agrees, and the three of them go back to Glenn's B&B. Once they got there, Sabina apparently was constantly looking out all of the windows, acting very paranoid, and then at one point she offers the men a cigarette, and the men accept, and she hands them their cigarette, and she's about to light their cigarettes when she suddenly snatches them out of their mouths and says, "Oh, these might be poisoned," and she throws them in the trash. Just before midnight, Peter leaves, and Glenn and Sabina go to sleep in their respective rooms. The next day, Glenn gets up to make tea and food for Sabina, who's downstairs in the kitchen, but Glenn realizes he's out of tea bags. So he goes outside and he hollers to his neighbor Frank and says, "Hey, can I borrow some tea bags?" Frank gives him the tea bags. Glenn goes back inside. About a minute later, Frank recalls seeing Glenn stagger out of the B&B, clutching his stomach, screaming, "She stabbed me." And apparently his last words were, "Frank, take care of my dog," before he ultimately died. Frank immediately calls the police, and Sabina immediately leaves the B&B and takes off running. She gets to a highway and she's running along the side of this highway, and a motorist named Josh sees Sabina running, and she's clutching a hammer that she's repeatedly hitting herself in the head with as she's running. Josh drives well past her and gets out to try to intercept her, but as she's running past him, she pulls a roof tile out of her pocket and throws it and hits Josh in the head. She runs past Josh, who's now clutching his head and can't stop her. She gets to this bridge that overlooks another road and she leaps off. It's 40 feet to the ground, and when she hits the ground, she breaks both ankles and fractures her skull, but she lives and narrowly escapes being hit by another car. Eventually, police and paramedics are called, who transfer Sabina to a hospital where she once again is acting totally normal. Nothing like the crazy person that killed Glenn or was throwing roof tiles just hours earlier. Sabina would ultimately be arrested for murdering Glenn, and she would plead guilty to manslaughter, but she gave absolutely no explanation of why any of this happened. It was like she didn't understand and was a different person now. The defense claimed that although Sabina certainly killed Glenn, she should have diminished responsibility because she was suffering from a condition known as folie à deux. It's a French term that means madness of two, and basically it only presents itself in identical twins where one twin has a psychotic break and they transmit their insanity to the other twin. And amazingly, the prosecution accepted this claim and they only gave Sabina 5 years for her crimes. Sabina would serve her 5-year sentence and was released in 2011, and to this day is a free woman. Here are some highlights from that film crew that captured Ursula and Sabina acting totally crazy on the side of the highway. In June of 2011, law student Lauren Giddings was only one test away from completing her dream and becoming a public defender. Even though she had a ton of studying still to do, she had taken off the first week in June to go to her sister's wedding where she was the maid of honor. Right before she left the wedding to go back to school, she joked with her family that she was going to be locking herself in the library and just studying 24/7 and that nobody should get in touch with her. But when she got back to campus, none of her classmates that she studied with saw her at the library. And in fact, when they didn't see her for a couple of days, they started reaching out to her and texting her and calling her to see if she was okay. But she never picked up, she never wrote back, and so no one knew what was going on with her. One of Lauren's classmates would reach out to Lauren's sister and would ask her, hey, have you talked to your sister at all, because we haven't seen her? And Lauren's sister would write back and say, oh no, everything is just fine. Lauren told us before she left the wedding that she was going to be locking herself away and just studying 24/7, so I'm sure everything is just fine. But this classmate wasn't convinced because this felt very uncharacteristic of Lauren to not study at the library and then not to pick up any phone calls or text messages. So she would call the police and say, hey, can you please go check on Lauren's apartment because I think something's wrong. So a police officer goes over to Lauren's apartment and knocks on the door. Lauren doesn't answer. They try the door, it's locked. The officer goes outside and looks around the outside of her apartment. There's no broken windows. There's no obvious signs of a break-in. And so the officer leaves and says, I can't do anything else unless you guys file a missing person report. So a couple of days go by and there's still no word from Lauren. And at this point, Lauren's family is now concerned and they do file a missing persons report. So the police go back to Lauren's apartment. They try knocking. She doesn't come to the door. The door is still locked. So they get the owner of the apartment building to open up her door. And when they go inside, Lauren's not in there, and at first, it doesn't seem like anything is wrong until they notice her cell phone, her keys, her purse, and her laptop are all still in there. This made the police think there could be something sinister happening here, and so they went to Lauren's friends and family and they asked, does she have any enemies? Does she have any reason to be fearful for her life? Initially, they said no one would want to harm Lauren. Everybody loves Lauren. But Lauren's sister would say to the police that there was actually one comment Lauren made a year ago that now seemed a little bit more relevant. Lauren had just got back from a vacation and she noticed there were things in her apartment that seemed like they had been moved, like someone else had been here. but no one was supposed to be in her apartment. And so she told her sister, and the two of them talked about it a little bit, but it was quickly forgotten about because there wasn't a reasonable explanation, and Lauren was so busy with school, she didn't pursue it. After police have done a thorough investigation of the inside of Lauren's apartment, they move outside of her apartment and begin scanning the exterior of the building, and they make a huge discovery. An officer who was looking in the dumpster noticed this big black trash bag that looked out of place, and when he tried to move it, it was very heavy, and when they opened it, they found a human torso, and it was Lauren's. Right before this discovery was made, a news crew had shown up outside the apartment building and was trying to interview people that lived in the apartment complex because they had been tipped off that somebody who was living here had been missing for over a week, and now police were getting involved. They saw what looked like a resident of the building looking visibly shaken up, watching the police doing their investigation, and they went over to interview him. It would turn out his name was Stephen McDaniel, and he was Lauren's neighbor, and he was a classmate of hers in law school. The interviewer asked Stephen, "What was your last interaction with Lauren?" And Stephen became really focused on how he had not seen her in the last week. And in fact, speaking on behalf of my other classmates, no one's seen her. She must have just vanished. As they're doing this interview, right on the other side of a bush, this police officer discovers Lauren's torso, and the news kind of gets out to the interviewer, they've found a body. And the interviewer says out loud to Stephen, "It looks like they found a body." And Stephen just completely changes, and he goes, "A body?" And then he goes completely silent to the point where the interviewer says, "Are you okay?" And he just stands there looking completely distant before walking away from the interviewer, sitting down with his back turned, and hyperventilates before the interview ends. Once this case went from missing person to homicide, the police started searching all the rooms on Lauren's floor. And Stephen's room is right next to Lauren's, so he was the first room they searched. Apparently, as they began searching his room, he was standing just outside the door and sweating profusely and drank over 10 bottles of water. In his apartment, they found a key to Lauren's apartment. And what he would do is whenever she was gone, he would sneak into her room and download her hard drive, as well as steal little souvenirs like small articles of clothing and other things that he would hoard in his apartment. When they went on Stephen's computer and checked his browser history, basically the only things he did on the internet were look at Lauren's Facebook and LinkedIn profiles. But the creepiest thing they found was this camera that was literally duct taped to this long pole. And on the camera were all these surveillance videos of Lauren, because what he would do is he would go outside and he would hoist up this camera and he would film her through her windows in the middle of the night. Stephen was quickly charged with Lauren's murder, to which he pled guilty, and he would openly confess to the details of how she died in court. Most times, he used this surveillance footage to confirm she was not in her apartment so he could sneak in and steal from her. But on the day she was murdered, he would use that camera technique to confirm she was home. And shortly after confirming she was in fact home and asleep, he put on a mask and used his key to get into her apartment and walked right into her room, which woke her up. According to Stephen, she apparently sat up and said, "You need to leave." At this point, he jumps on the bed, and in their struggle, his mask would come off, and Lauren would recognize it's clearly Stephen, and she would plead with him by name to stop. But he didn't stop, and he would strangle her to death. Afterwards, he dragged her into the bathroom and began cutting her up into fairly small pieces. Some of those pieces got flushed down the toilet. The others were put in bags, and only one of those bags was ever discovered, and that was the one of her torso. Stephen was ultimately given a life sentence. Here is a highlight of Stephen's interview when it's revealed that they've discovered Lauren's body.
I mean, no one has seen her since Saturday. I haven't seen anything. I mean, I've always heard noise outside, but it's just people walking by pretty much. I mean, we just don't know where she is.
What about in the parking lot area? I know they've been doing a lot of, I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there.
Body?
Had you seen anything there? Had you seen anything there? I mean, we don't know if this is the same person. You know what I mean? Like, they took out a body there earlier. We don't know if it's the same person or not. So that's why we're trying to ask people if they know who lived there. Are you okay, sir?
I think I need to sit down.
Okay.